I uncovered one secret that shattered my marriage, only to find it was just the beginning. What I discovered next turned my life, and hers, upside down. My name's Matt, I'm 33, and up until a few weeks ago, I thought my wife, Laura, was the one person in my life I could trust completely. We've been married for 5 years, no kids yet, and life has always felt pretty solid, at least, until recently. It all started with little things. Laura's always been a bit of a private person, but lately, she's been more distant. Her phone's glued to her hand, and she doesn't leave it out anymore, not even for a second. I'll admit, I'm not one to snoop or pry. We've always respected each other's space. But lately, she's seemed, well, distracted. Like she's only halfway there when we're talking, like her mind is somewhere else entirely. A few days ago, she came home later than usual, saying she'd gone to pick up a few things from a store across town. I thought it was odd, she didn't usually go out of her way for errands, especially after work. But she brushed it off, saying she wanted to check out a new place that had good deals. I didn't think too much of it. Laura's always been the type to look for discounts and save a few bucks here and there. But that night, she seemed off. She was quiet, her eyes avoiding mine, and when I asked if everything was okay, she just smiled and told me she was exhausted. I wanted to believe her, to let it go, but something didn't feel right. After that night, things didn't get any better. In fact, the weirdness started piling up. Every time Laura came home late, she had an excuse ready. She'd been running errands, meeting up with friends, or, once, she even claimed she'd lost track of time browsing the aisles at that same store across town. It was starting to feel scripted. Like she'd rehearsed these answers in her head before stepping through the door. I tried not to let it get to me, tried to remind myself that she was probably just stressed. But every time she mentioned that store, something inside me twisted. Then one evening, we were sitting on the couch, and she got a text. She laughed, one of those soft, private laughs she used to save for me. I asked what was funny, and she quickly flipped her phone over, the smile disappearing. "Oh, just a funny meme from work," she said, shrugging it off. But something didn't sit right with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more going on. So, the next day, I decided to check out this store she kept talking about. So, the next day, I drove across town to this store. It was a small, out-of-the-way place that seemed a little odd for her to visit so frequently. As I walked in, I half expected to find some unbelievable deals that would explain why she'd been so hooked on this place. But instead, it looked like any other discount store. I wandered the aisles, trying to figure out what was so special about it. Then, as I was browsing, I noticed a young guy at the checkout counter. He looked like he was in his early 20s, maybe a little scruffy, with a certain cockiness to his smile as he chatted with a customer. I glanced away, trying not to overthink things, but just as I was about to leave, I heard him call out to a colleague nearby. "Hey, did Laura say she was coming in today?" he asked, a little too casually. My stomach dropped. Laura? There were plenty of people with that name, right? But he wasn't done. The cashier's friend just laughed and shook his head. "Dude, you've got it bad. If she's coming in, she'll let you know, won't she?" I felt a wave of shock, like the ground had been ripped out from under me. I wasn't sure what I was hearing or what it meant, but something in the way he said her name, that familiar tone, didn't sit right. I felt my heart start to pound, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to answer. I left the store, not even sure how to process what I just overheard. It felt like a slap in the face, a hint at something I'd been blind to. After leaving the store, I sat in my car in the far corner of the parking lot, still reeling from what I'd overheard. I couldn't shake that guy's tone, the casual mention of her name as if he knew her on a level that didn't sit right with me. But I needed to know for sure, so I did something I never thought I'd do. I decided to call her and see what she'd say. I took a deep breath, steadying my voice, and dialed her number. After a couple of rings, she picked up. "Hey, babe, she said, sounding cheerful, a bit too casual. "What's up?" I glanced at the store's entrance, half expecting to see her walking through the doors at any second. "I was just wondering what your plans were tonight," I said, keeping my tone light. "Thought maybe we could grab dinner." There was a pause, just a second longer than usual, and I could almost hear the gears turning in her mind. "Oh, I'd love to, honey, but I'm actually going to be late at work," she replied. "Just swamped with deadlines, you know how it is." My chest tightened. "Ah, got it," I said, doing my best to keep my voice steady. "Nothing too urgent. I just thought it'd be nice to grab a bite together. But we'll save it for another time when work isn't crazy." "Absolutely," she said, sounding almost relieved. "Another time, when things calm down a bit. Promise." "Sure," I replied, managing a small laugh. "Good luck with the work stuff, then." "Love you." "Love you, too," she said, and we hung up. I lowered the phone, staring blankly at the steering wheel. If I'd ever doubted before, those doubts were gone now. She'd lied effortlessly, creating a fake work excuse without hesitation. And I had a feeling that after that call, she'd be showing up at this store. So I waited, watching the store entrance, certain that any minute now, Laura would walk in like she had nothing to hide. I sat in that parking lot, watching the entrance of the store like my life depended on it. At first, I felt confident she'd be there any minute. But an hour passed, and nothing. Then 2 hours. My patience was wearing thin, and I started to question everything. What if she really was stuck at work? What if I was being paranoid, letting a stupid conversation and a few coincidences mess with my head? I was just about to call it and head home when, in the glow of the streetlights, I saw her. There was Laura, walking briskly toward the entrance of the store, her face partly hidden by her scarf, but it was unmistakably her. My stomach twisted with a sickening mix of relief and dread. So, she'd lied about work. But why? What was so important about this little store that she'd go behind my back? I watched her go inside, feeling my heart pounding harder with every step she took. I had half a mind to barge in after her right then, but something held me back. I wanted to see what she was really up to. So I stayed in the car, thinking that any minute now, she and the cashier would come strolling out together, maybe headed off somewhere else. I sat in my car, fingers drumming against the steering wheel as I watched the minutes tick by. The parking lot was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of silence that pulls at your nerves and makes every little sound feel amplified. 20 minutes felt like an eternity. I kept glancing at the store's entrance, hoping to see Laura walk out, but all I got was a growing sense of unease that twisted tighter with every second. I couldn't sit there any longer. I had to know. Turning off the ignition, I got out and headed toward the store, my footsteps feeling heavier than they should. The automatic doors slid open with a quiet hiss, and I stepped into the bright, artificial glow of the store's lights. The place was nearly empty, aisles stretching out in front of me like a maze, with shadows pooling at the ends. The silence felt thick, interrupted only by the soft hum of the lights above and the faint murmur of a radio crackling in the back. I walked slowly, my eyes scanning each aisle, searching for any glimpse of Laura. I thought maybe I'd see her browsing, casually chatting with someone. But each row was emptier than the last, lined only with products neatly stacked on shelves that seemed to stretch forever. It felt surreal, like I'd stepped into a place where time didn't exist. Every corner, every aisle was a dead end. Finally, I made my way to the checkout counter, expecting to see the young cashier she seemed to know so well, maybe even talking to her there. But the counter was vacant, the register sitting in silence. I looked around, almost hoping he'd pop up out of nowhere, that this was all just some bizarre coincidence. But there was no one, not a single soul. I turned and walked further into the store, checking each aisle one more time, my pulse quickening. I noticed a door marked "Employees Only," slightly ajar near the back of the store, and I hesitated. It wasn't my place, but something about it drew me in, the curiosity gnawing at me until I couldn't ignore it. I stepped closer, listening, my ears straining for any hint of a conversation, a laugh, a sound, anything. But there was only silence. Heart pounding, I walked further down the dimly lit corridor, the silence thickening with each step. Just as I reached the end, I heard it, a low, unmistakable groan coming from behind a door marked storage. I froze, every nerve in my body on high alert. My mind raced, fighting against the possibilities, telling myself that I must be mistaken. But that small sound shattered any last shred of doubt I'd been holding on to. I reached for the doorknob, hesitating for just a second before pushing it open. The sight that greeted me hit like a punch to the gut. There, on a cluttered table surrounded by stacks of boxes and inventory, was Laura, my wife, the woman I'd trusted completely, lying bare and exposed, her body entwined with the young cashier. They hadn't heard the door, too engrossed in each other, oblivious to the world outside. Time seemed to slow as I took in the scene, a sickening sense of betrayal flooding over me. I could barely process it, my mind struggling to match this image with the person I thought I knew. Every quiet excuse, every late-night work trip, every lie clicked into place in an instant. This was it, the truth laid out in front of me, as raw and undeniable as it could get. I wanted to shout, to scream, to demand answers. But instead, I stood there, my heart pounding, my body frozen in shock, realizing that everything I thought I knew had just been ripped away in an instant. My body moved on instinct, fury, and betrayal fueling every step. Before I knew it, I was inside the room, storming toward them. The cashier looked up in alarm, confusion flashing across his face before it turned to fear. But I didn't give him a chance to react. I shoved him hard, sending him stumbling backward, crashing into a stack of boxes. The contents toppled around him as he struggled to regain his balance. Laura gasped, her face pale as she scrambled to cover herself, pulling a crumpled piece of clothing to her chest. Her eyes were wide, a mixture of shock and guilt filling them as she stared at me. Matt, I can explain, she stammered, but her voice was weak, barely above a whisper. I ignored her words, grabbing her by the arm and pulling her upright, my voice filled with a rage I barely recognized as my own. What the hell is this, Laura? I yelled, my voice bouncing off the walls of the small, dimly lit room. Late nights at work? Running errands? Is this what you've been sneaking around to do? Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She looked as stunned as I felt, her face frozen in an expression of fear and shame. She tried to speak, her lips moving silently as if searching for the right words, but the guilt was written all over her face. Before either of us could say another word, hurried footsteps echoed down the hallway outside. The door swung open, and two figures appeared in the doorway, another cashier and the warehouse manager. They stopped in their tracks, their eyes widening as they took in the scene in front of them, Laura, exposed and humiliated, struggling to cover herself, and the cashier still sprawled against a pile of fallen boxes, his face flushed with embarrassment. The warehouse manager, a graying man in his 50s, stared at us, his mouth agape as he struggled to process what he was seeing. What's going on here?" he finally managed, his voice weak with shock. I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and hollow, filled with more pain than I cared to admit. I let go of Laura, stepping back and looking at her as if she were a stranger. "You know what?" I said, my voice shaking with anger and disbelief. "If this is who you are, Laura, then fine. Go ahead. Sleep with everyone in this store, for all I care. Just don't come back to my house." She reached out toward me, her face crumbling with desperation. "Matt, please, let me explain." But I didn't want to hear it. I was done with the lies, the excuses, the years of trusting someone who'd shattered everything in a single moment. Ignoring her pleas, I turned and pushed past the small crowd that had gathered in the doorway, their eyes wide with shock and curiosity, as they whispered among themselves. Without looking back, I walked out of that store, each step feeling heavier than the last, but knowing I was finally walking away from the biggest lie of my life. Leaving that store, I felt like a different person, one with nothing left to lose and a burning resolve to make them pay. I wasn't going to let Laura walk away unscathed after shattering my life, and that cashier. He'd chosen to step into this mess with no respect for me or my marriage. They were both going to feel the consequences, and I would make sure of it. For the next few days, I barely slept, devising a plan that would leave them both regretting everything. Laura had lied to me effortlessly, led me to believe in her, only to betray me in the most humiliating way possible. I wanted them to feel what it was like to lose everything. The first step was making sure everyone knew the truth about Laura. Our friends, her family, and even our co-workers had always seen us as the picture-perfect couple. I went through our shared social media photos, choosing the ones that painted the clearest story of our relationship, our wedding day, vacations, celebrations with friends, and then I paired each photo with a brutal message describing what she'd done. I posted the entire collection, along with a short message. The woman in these photos? She's the one who promised me a lifetime, who swore she'd never betray me. And yet, here we are, because she couldn't keep that promise and thought she could keep it hidden. Well, now everyone will know who she really is. As the messages and comments poured in, I could see the ripple effect it had. Friends messaged me in shock, her family reached out in disbelief, and even co-workers sent messages of support, saying they'd never seen it coming. The perfect image Laura had crafted for herself shattered in a single post. Laura and I had shared finances, and while she'd always had her own accounts, I'd also managed our joint funds. I transferred all the money from our joint savings account into my personal account, leaving her with the bare minimum to cover only immediate expenses. Then I went through our monthly subscriptions and memberships, ones she loved, from her yoga studio to her salon and even her favorite streaming services. I cancelled each one, removing her access. I wanted her to feel what it was like to suddenly be left without the luxuries she'd taken for granted, to feel the ground slip out from under her just as she'd done to me. Finally, I pulled out the big guns. I called our landlord. With our lease up for renewal in just a couple of months, I let him know I wouldn't be re-signing. She'd be forced to either move out or find a way to cover the full rent on her own, an amount I knew she couldn't afford without my income. But it didn't end with Laura. That cashier was going to feel this just as much. I did a little digging and found out that he'd only been working at that store for a few months. It didn't take long to find the store manager's contact information. I called him, telling him I had information about one of his employees that he'd want to know. I explained the entire situation, detailing how this cashier had gotten involved with a married woman, meeting her in the back room of the store during work hours. The manager sounded stunned, but the anger was unmistakable in his voice. He thanked me for letting him know, and by the time I was done, I had no doubt that the cashier would be facing disciplinary action, if not outright termination. He'd gone from thinking he could fool around with someone else's wife to losing his job and reputation all in one swoop. The last piece of my revenge was personal. I went back to the house we'd shared, packed every one of Laura's belongings, and boxed them up. I left them in the garage with a single note on top, written in bold letters. This is everything you wanted, right? Your new life, free from me. Well, here it is. Don't ever come back. After locking the house, I left her key on the kitchen counter and closed the door for the last time. Walking away. I watched from my car as Laura showed up later that evening, her face a mixture of shock and panic as she saw the boxes and the note. She tried calling me, but I'd already blocked her number. She tried reaching out through mutual friends, but they were on my side, just as disgusted with her betrayal as I was. In the end, she lost everything, her friends, her financial stability, her home, and the life she'd so carelessly thrown away. The cashier who thought he could cross those lines so easily now had no job and a reputation that would haunt him. I'd made sure of it. As I drove away that night, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I'd closed that chapter, burned every bridge, and I was finally free from the lies, from the betrayal, and from the people who thought they could use me and walk away unscathed. They'd built their world on lies, and now that world was in ruins. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. With Laura and the chaos of our failed marriage behind me, I felt a strange calm. The storm I'd been caught in for so long had finally cleared, and now there was just silence. No more betrayal, no more lies, and no more pretending that things were fine. I'd cut off every connection that tied me to that life, and with each passing day, I felt lighter. To truly start fresh, I decided to move out of the city. It was filled with too many memories, too many reminders of what I'd lost and who I'd trusted. I found a small town a few hours away, a quiet place where I could rebuild in peace. I rented a modest apartment and found a new job that didn't tie me to any of the people from my past. Here, I was just Matt, a guy with a clean slate and nothing left to prove. For the first time in years, I rediscovered parts of myself I'd forgotten. I started running again, picking up books I'd left unread, and even got back into cooking, a hobby Laura had once made fun of as boring. I realized how much of myself I'd set aside just to fit into the image of what I thought she wanted. But now, I was living for me. As the weeks passed, I found myself drawn into the community, meeting people who knew nothing about my past. There was no history, no judgment, just new faces and new friendships. One of those friendships was with Sarah, a local artist I met at a coffee shop. We'd strike up conversations here and there, initially just small talk about work and art, but eventually, we found ourselves opening up about our lives. Sarah had her own stories of betrayal and heartbreak, and we bonded over that shared experience of starting over. I felt a connection I hadn't felt in a long time, easy, unforced, and real. We didn't rush things. She knew I was healing, and I knew she had her own path. But there was an unspoken understanding between us, a spark that reminded me that trust, though damaged, could be rebuilt. One day, as I was getting ready to close a chapter on my old life, I received an unexpected message in my inbox. It was from an unknown number, but the message was short, almost desperate. "Matt, please. I just need to talk. It's Laura." My heart skipped a beat, but not out of longing or pain. It was a strange feeling, a reminder of who I had been and what I'd survived. I didn't reply, of course. Her chapter was long closed in my book. But the message was proof that my life had changed. Her power over me was gone, and whatever chaos she was facing now was no longer my concern. I went to the beach that weekend, a place I'd come to love for its quiet and solitude. Standing there, looking out over the waves, I realized that I'd found my closure. Laura's message, the look on her face as she'd seen her things packed up, the life I'd built since then, all of it had led to this moment of freedom. I wasn't defined by her betrayal, or even by the revenge I'd taken. Those were just parts of a journey that had brought me back to myself. I felt whole again, unburdened and stronger, with a future that was mine to shape, not dependent on anyone else's lies or expectations. As I watched the sun set over the water, I took a deep breath, feeling that chapter finally close, for real this time. Whatever came next, I knew I was ready. Just when I thought I had closed the door on my past for good, a letter arrived that forced it open again. It was from my lawyer, marked urgent. I opened it, expecting routine divorce updates, maybe a few final details about property division or paperwork. But what I found hit me like a gut punch. In an official statement to the court, Laura had declared that she was pregnant. She claimed the child was mine, and she had requested the court delay the divorce proceedings until after the baby was born so a paternity test could be conducted. My lawyer's letter explained that Laura had, in fact, tried to reach me several times. She'd called and texted multiple times, but I'd blocked her number after everything that had happened. Apparently, she'd also sent messages through mutual friends, asking them to reach me on her behalf, insisting that this was something I needed to know. When none of those worked, she resorted to the court. Now, Laura was using every official channel available to pull me back into the mess I thought I'd left behind. I didn't know what to think. My anger boiled over, blending with shock and disbelief. Could she really be serious? Was this just another one of her twisted games, a desperate ploy to keep some hold on me after all the lies, the betrayal, the humiliation? Or was she telling the truth? As furious as I was, a part of me knew I couldn't ignore this. No matter how much I wanted to turn my back on her and every part of our life together, this was different. If there was even a chance it could be true, I needed to know. The following days were a storm of conversations with my lawyer as we strategized for yet another legal battle. He was as shocked as I was, but he reminded me that we needed to be cautious. If she was lying, the paternity test would reveal it soon enough. But until then, her claims were putting our entire case on hold, dragging out a divorce I wanted finalized more than anything. It felt like she was trying to trap me again, twisting this claim into another attempt to manipulate the court, or worse, manipulate me. And despite my rage and disbelief, I couldn't fully push aside the possibility that this was real. If she was actually pregnant with my child, I had a responsibility to see this through. It was a burden I hadn't asked for, but one I knew I couldn't avoid. When the court date arrived, I walked in with my head held high, ready to confront whatever story she had come up with this time. Laura sat across the room, her expression one I hadn't seen before, a mix of anxiety and determination. She looked fragile, almost, but I reminded myself that appearances had always been her specialty. I was done letting them sway me. My lawyer presented our side, meticulously laying out every detail of her affair, her deception, the financial game she'd played to try and secure some part of my assets. He argued that her claims of pregnancy could easily be another one of her manipulations, an attempt to delay the divorce and keep her foot in the door. Laura's lawyer countered, claiming she'd tried to reach me multiple times before taking it to the court, that she'd been attempting to keep the family whole. They painted her as a woman trying to do the right thing for her unborn child, reaching out to the father as a final attempt at reconciliation. I wasn't moved. I'd heard enough of her lies. But the court needed proof. The judge ruled that a paternity test would be conducted immediately after the child's birth and warned Laura of the consequences should her claims turn out to be false. Her face paled slightly, but she nodded, holding her composure. As we left the courtroom, I felt a sense of calm, stronger than I'd ever expected. This chapter was almost over. Whatever came of it, I'd soon have the truth in hand, and I was ready to face it, on my terms, once and for all. A few days after the court hearing, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, I heard Laura's voice on the other end, sounding hesitant, almost fragile. "Matt, please, don't hang up. I just need to talk to you," she said, her voice wavering. I could feel the anger simmering beneath my calm exterior, but I held it in, curious to see what she could possibly have left to say. "Go ahead, Laura." "I'm listening," I replied, my tone cold. She took a deep breath before launching into a speech I hadn't expected. "Matt, I know things got out of hand, but I want us to try and work this out. We have a history, memories, and, with the baby, we could have a future together. I made a mistake, one that I regret every single day. But maybe, for the sake of what we had, for the sake of this baby, we could try to rebuild our family." I couldn't hold back the scoff that escaped me. "Our family?" I repeated, anger seeping into my words. "You want to rebuild our family? Where was this desire for a family when you were sneaking around with that cashier, Laura? You made that choice, remember? You didn't care about our history or our family then, did you?" She paused, and I could hear her breathing, shaky and uncertain. "I made a mistake, Matt," she said softly. "It was a moment of weakness, a stupid decision I regret more than anything." "Right. A moment of weakness," I shot back, sarcasm laced with every word. "Funny how that moment lasted long enough for you to sneak around, lie to my face, and betray everything we built. And now, you suddenly want to save what's left. There was silence on the line. I could sense her struggling to find the words to defend herself, to justify what she'd done. Finally, she spoke, her voice thick with desperation. I know I can't undo what happened. But maybe if we raise this child together, we can still have a future. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. We'll see whose child it is, Laura. And if you're so set on having a family, maybe you should go find that cashier and start your fresh future with him. Because whatever future you're imagining with me, that ended the day you betrayed us. She stifled a sob, and I could hear the tears in her voice. Matt, please. I'll do anything. I just want one more chance. But I was done. Goodbye, Laura, I said, ending the call and blocking her number once again. I set the phone down, feeling a strange mix of anger and relief. She'd made her choices, and now she'd face the consequences, whatever they might be. Months had passed since that last call, the one where Laura had begged me to take her back. Despite her claims of wanting to rebuild our family, I hadn't heard from her since I'd shut her down, and I'd managed to push the whole ordeal out of my mind. Then, out of nowhere, I received a notification from the court, informing me that the time had come to complete the paternity test. I showed up at the clinic, filled with a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. Part of me was ready to face the final truth, to hear that the child wasn't mine and be able to shut that chapter of my life forever. But there was also a small part, one I hated to admit existed, that wanted the opposite, to find out that the child was mine so that, no matter how twisted it was, there was some meaning behind all this chaos. I took a deep breath, went into the clinic, and signed the necessary paperwork. I was escorted to a sterile-looking room where a technician swabbed my cheek for DNA, and within minutes, I was done. Relieved to be free of that suffocating space, I walked toward the exit, ready to leave this nightmare behind me. That's when I saw them. Walking down the hallway toward the testing room was Laura, holding the hand of the one person I'd hoped never to see again, the cashier from the store. My mind reeled, flashing back to the day I'd caught them together, her desperate pleas on the phone afterward, and her hollow promises about wanting to save our family. And yet, here she was, bringing the same guy who'd wrecked everything, now accompanying her as she took a paternity test. I couldn't help the bitter laugh that escaped me as I watched them. She had the audacity to talk about building a future with me while keeping him right at her side. Was this her idea of saving the family? I shook my head, disgusted with her hypocrisy. Well, Laura, I thought, and here you were, trying to convince me that you wanted to fix things. You're even more delusional than I thought. You actually expected me to believe you wanted a future with me while parading this guy around? As they disappeared into the testing room, I felt a sense of clarity wash over me. I didn't need to hear the test results to know that my life was better without her, and whatever connection she thought we'd keep between us was over, truly over. She could have her life with that cashier, her messy lies, her empty promises. I'd finally be free, and if the universe had any sense of justice, I'd soon find out that her child wasn't mine. With one last look back, I walked out of that clinic, feeling the weight lift off my shoulders with every step. The day of the final court hearing arrived, and as I sat in the courtroom, I couldn't help but feel a mixture of nerves and anticipation. This was it, the last chapter of this drawn-out nightmare. Across from me sat Laura, visibly tense, clutching her lawyer's arm as if it were her lifeline. Her eyes flickered to me a few times, but I refused to acknowledge her. Today wasn't about her excuses or empty pleas. Today was about the truth. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. He wasted no time, holding up an official-looking envelope. Inside were the results of the paternity test, the proof that would either tether me to Laura's deceit or finally free me from it. He looked over the courtroom, then slowly opened the envelope, pulling out the single piece of paper that would answer everything. His gaze settled on the page for a long moment before he looked up, his expression unreadable. The court has received the results of the paternity test, he announced. And it is confirmed that Mr. Matthews is not the father of the child. A wave of relief washed over me so powerful that I had to grip the edge of the bench to steady myself. The tension in my chest finally released, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe freely. I wasn't the father. I was free. The judge continued, his tone growing firmer. As I mentioned in previous sessions, any dishonesty in these proceedings would be met with consequences. Mrs. Matthews, you were warned about the gravity of your actions, and yet you chose to proceed with this claim, knowing it had no merit. Laura's face went white, her grip tightening on her lawyer's arm as if that could somehow save her. But there was no sympathy left in this courtroom, not from the judge, and certainly not from me. He continued, in addition to the fraudulent paternity claim, evidence has been submitted that you, Mrs. Matthews, attempted to contact Mr. Matthews under the guise of saving your marriage, while actively resuming relations with the individual involved in your original infidelity. The judge's voice was icy as he turned his gaze to her. This reveals a consistent pattern of deceit and manipulation on your part, a clear attempt to maintain control over Mr. Matthews' life while having no intention to honor the commitments you made to him. Laura looked as if she were about to speak, but her lawyer placed a hand on her shoulder, signaling her to stay silent. The judge's voice was calm but unyielding as he issued his final ruling. In light of these findings, the court officially grants Mr. Matthews a divorce on the grounds of irreconcilable differences due to deceit and adultery. Furthermore, Mrs. Matthews, your actions constitute an abuse of the legal system, and you will be held accountable. You will be required to cover all legal fees incurred by Mr. Matthews during these proceedings, as well as a formal reprimand for attempting to deceive the court. Laura's face crumbled as she listened, the realization finally hitting her that every last attempt to manipulate her way out of this had failed. She'd lied, schemed, and betrayed, all to cling to something she'd already destroyed, and now she was reaping the consequences. As the gavel came down, signaling the end of the trial, I felt an overwhelming sense of closure. Laura had gambled everything and lost, and for the first time, she was facing the full weight of her choices. She was left with nothing, not me, not the family she pretended to want, and not even the respect of those who once trusted her. As I walked out of that courtroom, I knew I was finally free from her lies, her manipulations, and the twisted reality she tried to trap me in. My life was mine again, and with each step away from her in that courtroom, I felt the weight of her deceit lift, leaving nothing but a future that was truly, finally, my own.